picking up and carted it to her rented house, she had to get to the feed store. While her customers had been understanding, she couldn't expect unlimited patience. George Tucker, her assistant, he'd been her father's assistant too, was trustworthy and reliable, but responsibility for Frasier Feed was Ellie's, and she couldn't forget that. Which meant she couldn't take the time to grieve properly. Not when she was short-staffed during the busiest season of the year. June brought with it a flurry of activity on the neighboring cattle ranches, and many of those ranchers would be looking to her for their feed and supplies. By the third trip out to her truck, Ellie regretted turning down Glen's offer of help. Glen Patterson was quite possibly the best friend she'd ever had. Although she'd always known who Glen was, in a town the size of Promise, everyone knew everyone else, at least by sight. There was just enough difference in their ages to keep them in separate social circles during their school years. The Pattersons had been buying their feed from Frasier's for years. Her father and Glen's dad had played high school football together. For the past few years, Glen had been the one coming to town for supplies. When Ellie began to work full-time with her dad, she'd quickly developed a chatty, teasing relationship with Glen. She was light-hearted and quick-witted, and Glen shared her sense of humor. Before long, she'd found herself looking forward to their verbal exchanges. These days, whenever he stopped by, Ellie joined him for a cup of coffee. They usually sat on the bench in front of her store, idling away 15 or 20 minutes, depending on how busy she was. When the weather discouraged outdoor breaks, they sat in her office to enjoy a few minutes' respite. It got to be that they could talk about anything. She appreciated his wry good sense, his down-to-earth approach to life. Ellie tended to obsess about problems, but Glen took them in stride. While she ranted and raved, he'd lean his chair against the building wall and tuck his hands behind his head, quietly listening. Then he'd point out some error in her thinking, some incorrect assumption or faulty conclusion. Generally, he was right. His favorite expression was, "Don't confuse activity with progress." She could almost hear him saying it now. It had been a week or more since his last visit, and Ellie missed him. She could count on Glen to distract her, make her smile, perhaps even ease this gnawing pain. But when he'd offered to help her sort through the boxes, she'd declined, moving everything on her own, knowing she'd have to face these memories sooner or later, and preferring to do it alone. Within minutes of her arrival at the feed store, the place was bustling. Naturally, she was grateful for the business, but she would have liked a few moments to herself. Then again, perhaps it was best to be hurled into the thick of things, with no chance to dwell on her grief and all the changes taking place in her life. It was almost 2 before Ellie could dash into her office for 10 minutes to collect her thoughts and have lunch. Although her appetite was non-existent, she forced herself to eat half a sandwich and an apple. At her desk, she sifted through the phone messages and found one from Glen. It was unusual for him to call during the day, especially in early summer when he spent most of his time working with the herd. Just knowing she'd been in his thoughts buoyed her spirits. Since his parents had moved into town and opened the local bed and breakfast, Glen and his older brother Cal had taken over management of the ranch. Thus far, they'd kept the spread operating in the black, doing whatever work they could themselves, and hiring seasonal help when necessary. In the last few years, they'd begun crossbreeding their cattle with Grady Weston stock. The phone rang, and thinking it might be Glen, Ellie reached eagerly for the receiver. "Frasier Feed."
"Ellie, I'm glad you answered. It's Richard Weston."
If it couldn't be Glen, then Ellie felt pleased it was Richard. He'd recently returned to Promise after a 6-year absence, and they'd gone out on a couple of dates before her father's condition worsened.
"How are you?"
Richard asked in a concerned voice. "Fine," she responded automatically, which was easier than confessing the truth. She just couldn't talk about her grief, her deep sense of loss. Maybe Glen was the only person she could share that with, Ellie reflected. But not yet. It was too soon. For now, she needed to forge ahead and do what was necessary to get through the day.
"You've been on my mind a lot the last couple of weeks."
"I appreciate your thoughtfulness, Richard. I really do." Ellie was